We're looking at a chair, a seating symbol, a stool. This is the kind of thing people go and get off the internet. Someone drew the geometry. This is quite nice looking. We have it rendered under OpenGL. The issue is you inherit all the nonsense of the creator. A lot of people struggle and can't understand why, but the quality of some imported symbols is not very good. And then I think you get the other extreme where you have complexity that you don't need. So a good rule of thumb is if you're designing the chair, you should show the fasteners and the casters and any of the hardware. If you are designing a restaurant, a theater, a trade show exhibit, all of these things do not need the complexity in the symbol to represent something that looks good in the final output, the final PDF, the final rendering. How you render is how you draw. So to eliminate some of the problems, you should make sure you have simplicity. You only need as much geometry as the portrayal in the rendered image requires. Let's look at one thing here. For example, classes, none and dimension are the two standard classes in Vectorworks. But notice that there's like a 0. This is a common thing to come from some legacy CAD programs. Typically I would delete it and move everything to none. Then there's this one that makes sense and it doesn't. I'm going to delete that one and move it to none. And then this appears to be the overall setting. I'm going to delete this one and I'm going to move it to none. Now that doesn't mean that that symbol we're looking at, that chair, that stool, that seating is using these. But at the same point, when you import a symbol from out on the web, put it into a new drawing, and in that drawing, open up the classes in the organization palette, and you'll see what the symbol brings along with it. That is also another complication people run into. They don't know that there's an odd class, or 2 or 3, and they can't see this imported object, this imported geometry, once they get going into their drawing. So we're going to show you a couple views here. If we look at this chair, it looks in the classic Vectorworks OpenGL edges rendered. But if we look at it in wireframe, you see that this is the complexity of 3D that is typical of a lot of legacy software, where there is no 2D hybrid, 3D hybrid symbol. 2D, 3D in Vectorworks is kind of a unified state. So if we look at this, here's one of the things that I just laugh at, in that the bottom of the chair has some fasteners, hardware, and it's complex beyond any need, and you can even see that there's a Torx head screw in there. So what we need to do is we need to look at this and say, what do we want this for? When we look at it in this kind of view, most of it can be deleted. I have yet to have a customer in several decades of drawing in Vectorworks come back to me and say, oh, I don't see the levelers at the bottom of my stools. It doesn't happen. Again, if you're designing the chair, you need complexity with all the details, the hardware, the fastener, the fittings. If you're designing a restaurant, a theater, a trade show exhibit, you'll never notice that there aren't levelers on the bottom, or that these tubes aren't round. An easy way to reduce your file size is to make tubular things simply multi-sided. Now, one of the things that you'll notice in Vectorworks is if we render this as OpenGL with the lines showing, let's go to the OpenGL options here, and you say draw edges. You can see in the background there quite quickly that the legs don't look much worse, but the seat looks like it's hundreds of triangles. So we're going to show how to get rid of that also. And the key to this is reducing the file size of this item. A couple ways to do it is to take the geometry apart and eliminate things that are spurious. The other thing is to use the purge command and get rid of anything in here that you may not need. If we look at this fix this chair file, this is the original one, the one we're looking at, 832 kilobyte. Doesn't seem like a lot, but once we clean it up, it's only 487. That's not quite half. But if you do that to everything in your drawing, you basically reduce your geometry, and the computer doesn't think, oh, I don't need to render that, that's underneath the chair. The computer simply looks at all of the geometry. You can even see here that I isolated this Torx head. It's not a complete fastener, but they show the head, whoever drew this, and it's 152 kilobytes each times 4. So that's kind of ironic in that something that you will never see in your rendering takes up some room. Now multiply it again by 4 per stool, and then multiply it by 3 or 4 stools per bistro table, 50 bistro tables in an event layout, and you suddenly realize how the complexity adds up. So here we've taken the chair and separated it into pieces, and while some people might keep these pieces here, what I'm advocating you do is get rid of things like these pipe fittings, these pipe brackets, these pipe supports, and the fasteners from underneath. Now the other thing is these levelers on the bottom. I'm not advocating that you get rid of all details, but it seems like it's a detail that I'm not going to see at all. And when you realize that the complexity of it is such that, do you really need it? And when we look at it in its setting, again, we're talking about putting several of these stools together. The end product will look good in the scenario at hand. So let's look at this object here. This object is a group. We're going to edit the group. We're going to go in here and select all this. And you see that it's 2,836 3D polygons. Now, one of the things I like to do is I like to take this and say, modify, convert to mesh. So I now have one mesh. I'm noticing my class here is 0. I'm going to switch it to none. I'm going to close this, and I'm going to say modify, simplify mesh. I'm just going to take the default. So a couple things happen. One is, if you notice, here's all the lines in wireframe, but here is what it looks like in OpenGL. And because it is now a mesh, even though I have the draw edges on, you can see the difference on or off. The edges are only the edges. Previously, this was a large number of triangles that made up the shape. So now we've cleaned this up. It still has a segmented kind of appearance, but again, if we put this back together, you'll see I'm moving pieces back into place. You'll see that this symbol is at 0, 0. So this is at 0, 0. If we look in the wireframe, we see the wireframe version. And we see that it is a hybrid symbol, 2D, 3D. You can see a simple representation. This is a key for Vectorworks. What sets it apart is that I now have a simple version that will be part of my setup rather than the complexity or excessive geometry of a traditional CAD package where every line is shown, and it often is confusing to the client when you try and present. So here's OpenGL rendering. If we look at this in a setting, but here, so we put a bistro table in here. We're going to duplicate some of these. I prefer not to mirror them. Traditionally, mirror tool didn't create problems. In the modern idiom of Vectorworks, mirror can have problems in the long run, so the easiest thing I found to do is duplicate and then take the rotate tool and simply rotate, flip it to the other side, move it to the back. So I put these two in a group. I say duplicate and flip them and then ungroup them. You see how that rotated about the center because they're centered together, and I move this to the front. And now if I use the flyover tool and look at this, this renders in a nice visual, and you see that the hardware underneath the chairs isn't missing because you can't tell it's not there. You can see that the levelers at the bottom aren't there, but I think that's inconsequential. So what's the takeaway? We started with a stool. It's what I call inherited. meaning someone else drew it or someone else brought it into Vectorworks. You might work in a company with multiple people, or files might be years old. In this case, this is a rental chair, so we're using a standard image that comes out of the kit, but the complexity of it was such that it needed to be cleaned up. A, because you ended up with a better rendered image. I don't see lots of lines as in the original file. And the simplicity of it also means you're going to get a faster render time, smaller file size, and that's a big benefit. So the takeaway, if you are going to find something out on the web, or there are many manufacturers who provide CAD files of their product, put it in a new drawing to isolate it. Take a look at how it's composed. Look at things that will be superfluous to your final rendering, because how you render is how you should be drawing. That's not how a lot of people do it. They draw first, then they say, gee, I can't get it to look right. And eliminate any spurious things that are not needed. You can always save the item as the original file. And once you get it cleaned up and functional for your workflow, then bring it into your drawing. There's many ways to work in Vectorworks. That's how I drew it.